Okay, I think we'll get started. Hi, everyone. I'm Huda. Most of you, a lot of you I know already. Welcome to this webinar. So we host the Evaluation Roundtable here at IVAR. A lot of you know us already, which since its founding in 2014 has been working with foundation and learning staff to shift organisational practices and norms and mental models related to learning and accountability in philanthropy, so that they're better suited to the realities of complex social change. And as part of the Evaluation Roundtable, we convene evaluation and learning staff at an annual event. We host webinars. A lot of you know this already, but for those that you don't, we host webinars like this one and workshops, and we hold a community of practice. So the theme for our Evaluation Roundtable convening earlier this year was, how can we bring trust-based learning to life in a way that responds to the needs of different actors in the learning system and builds collective wisdom for more equitable social change? And I'll pop a link to the briefing for those that haven't seen that. So this theme is a natural meeting point between the Evaluation Roundtable and another initiative that we run, which is a fast-growing network of foundations committed to open and trusting grant making, many of you are part of that already, and I'll pop a link to that in the chat too. So in both the Evaluation Roundtable and Open and Trusting, we see foundations making commitments and working towards more equitable social change and trust-based approaches, but we know that it can't happen, that sort of more trust-based learning and grant making can't happen without greater equity and shared power. So we know a lot of you are grappling with how to bring this about. So we're really delighted to be hosting this webinar today with Tanya Beer, who many of you know already, our associate and also independent practitioner that specialises in strategic learning and facilitation, and also Emily Gates, assistant professor in evaluation and a practitioner and educator from Boston College. And I'll hand over to them in just a moment. Both Tanya and Emily specialise in supporting complex social change work at a large scale and systems change. And they're going to take us through this session on pressure testing ideas with the aim of shifting power in the development of the design of foundation strategies and evaluation work. So a little bit of housekeeping just before we start. So with this session will be recorded, so we can share it with others afterwards. We encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat if you'd like to. We'll spend the last 15 minutes of the session taking your questions, so please do post those in the chat too. I may invite you to ask your question and you'll be invited to come on screen and ask your question. Hopefully you'll be okay with that. And just to say that Emily will share her slides, and she's compiled an excellent list of resources at the end as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Tanya just to say a few words.
Excellent. Hi, everybody. It's lovely to see at least the names of many folks that I have had the pleasure of working with before. I just thought it might be useful before we turn it over to Emily to talk just a touch more about the origin story for this conversation. So we were as Huda said, in our last Evaluation Roundtable gathering, we were really thinking about this dilemma of trust-based philanthropy, trust-based learning, and changing the relationship between, on one level, foundations and the organizations who receive funds from foundations, funded organizations, and then also between funded organizations and the communities that they serve and work with. And one of the dilemmas we were really grappling with was this idea of, how do you create trust-based learning and better learning loops in a power uneven context, where foundations, I'll just use the foundation relationship as the grounding here, where the foundation is unlikely to receive from the folks who have a stake in maintaining a good relationship with a funder candid feedback. Their ideas are less likely to be contested or open to critique from other actors. So we're really struggling in our roundtable convening with, well, what does it look like to do that? What does it look like not just to have open feedback or conversation that might be about the foundation, how the foundation shows up in its grant relationships, et cetera, but really challenges ideas about strategy, about what priorities and outcomes matter to whom, and how can foundations, and then also in turn charitable organizations with communities, create more robust information flows that really challenge our thinking and open up our sense of a broader our sense of strategy to sort of broader perspectives, so that we can really hold ourselves more accountable for the commitments that many foundations make publicly to equity. What does that mean, and how do we create the information flows that support that? So we were thinking at the time that we needed to do some learning about different methods and approaches that might help create those kinds of opportunities to contest, to have our own foundation's own thinking contested and opened up to critique from other actors who don't have the power and the luxury of being able to make decisions without a clear line of accountability to any outside audience. And so we thought of Emily and the work that she's done that I've been very inspired about in my own practice, and the work on boundary critique. And so we reached out to Emily to help us learn more about the method and approach. And so she'll be spending the majority of our time today talking about it, teaching about it. And I will give you a few examples of where I have seen it play out for better and for worse, and what some of the challenges are practically with implementing this in a foundation setting. But I think it also applies to charitable organizations as well. So please pose questions as we go in the chat, and we'll hold them until the Q&A at the end. But as they come up to you, feel free to put them in the chat. And with that, I'm very excited also to be learning from Emily. So let's turn it over to her and we will dig right in.
Awesome. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, everybody, for being here, for making time for this. Boundary critique is something that I got interested in a while back, about 10 years now. I've been playing with the method and with the ideas and seeing them everywhere. So I'm going to talk to you about some everyday examples, as well as some more formal examples that you can use in relation to strategy. And Huda said that the slides will be available to you. So Tanya already set this up really well, but in the context of the shift to trust-based philanthropy and also thinking about equity within the evaluation process, we see there's two big opportunities in this space. So one is to think about this idea of pressure testing foundation strategy in terms of how problems or needs get framed, and missions and goals get set, and who participates and who doesn't in that kind of process. And that's one version in terms of pressure testing. And the other is really redefining what we mean by value and thinking about evaluative processes as value creation and value development, rather than simply just value determination or an assessment of impact or a measurement of impact. So thinking much more in an integrated manner, excuse me, about what value means from multiple perspectives. So boundary critique really aligns well with both of these intentions. In the time we've got, I'm going to go over 3 main points, and yeah, Tanya will jump in with examples at a couple of points. I'm just going to switch so I can see chat as well. Awesome. So I'm going to talk about why critique boundaries, what boundaries are and what does it mean to critique them and why that matters. A framework and process from a tradition called critical systems thinking. Systems approaches get a lot of attention, and critical orientations to systems get less attention within the broader philanthropic and evaluation fields. So I'm going to introduce this method. And then we're going to, at the end, talk a little bit about, or toward the closing, talk about what you can do and what your teams can do to get prepared for a boundary critique in your work. And Tanya's got a good cautionary story there and a set of tips to share. So first, why critique boundaries? we set boundaries in our professional lives and our interpersonal lives. So the concept of boundaries is one that already exists in our world and is familiar. This is a really simple definition. Choices about what is included and excluded. So it's a very open definition as well. There are a lot of things like decisions, norms, assumptions, judgments that could go under this choices. But the key is really that boundaries determine decisions or have implications for inclusion and exclusion. And another key piece of the definition of boundaries is that they're both descriptive and normative. So in teal in the middle, I have this italicized or should be. So when we think about boundaries and the idea of critiquing boundaries or opening them up for critique, we're saying, okay, how is the world now? Or how is our foundation strategy or our team decision-making process now? And how should it be normatively? And equity can be a normative stance that we bring to that question, but there are also other normative stances we can bring to that. So before I get into the professional related examples, I told Tanya and Huda I would share a little story about taking my nieces. These are two of my nieces to the beach this summer. And actually it was the week before we had our first call about this webinar. So you see my two nieces, the older one is on the right in the water. The younger one, who's about 3, is on the left. And they were building a sandcastle. I'm guessing some of you have had this experience with little kids, taking them to the beach and building the sandcastle. So 2 boundaries I noticed just in this little interaction that actually are the heart of what we're going to talk about in this session. One is, what is the bucket for? So Avery on the left has a sandcastle bucket. And in her mind, the bucket is for water. You fill it with water. Whereas on the right, Cameron had already designed, you can see the sandcastle in the middle here. She had already started to lay out a sandcastle and put a moat around it. So Cameron's idea was, oh, we're going to have a really nice sandcastle that's going to have all these components and a moat around it. And Avery said, no, I'm just here to have fun. She was filling the bucket with water and just dumping it on top of the sandcastle. At one point, you can see at the very bottom of the picture, she made a little slide so she could physically go and collapse the castle. So this example is very simple, and again, with my nieces all the time, but it was really a dilemma of purpose for them, and also what it was they were trying to do with a castle, what a good castle was. One person was thinking, Cameron was thinking, oh, we really need a full castle with a moat, and it's going to be pretty, and it's going to have these ideas with it. And Avery was like, the whole point of doing this is to have fun, and it's way more fun to destroy. So it's a simple conversation, but they actually argued about it as well because they each thought that they should have more decision-making power over the nature of this castle. So a simple example, but it's going to play out because that's the same kind of dynamic that boundary critique surfaces as we get into it in our own work. So let me see. I can't see your faces too, so I don't know how that example landed, but this next image is supposed to invite you to think about all the time. Like when I'm listening to the radio or listening to the news, I hear boundaries, and I'm going to give you some examples. Just the other day on my commute, some that came up on the radio, all within the span of an hour. But after this talk, I would really encourage you to take the lens of boundary and see where you hear small child or big political conversations in the news about boundaries and pushback and what they should be. So I was just listening to the radio on my commute back, and there were 3 that came up within the span of an hour. One in the US, the idea of what constitutes an insurrection. So in terms of President Trump and in the US, what happened on January 6th and the takeover of our Capitol, there's a lot of current conversation and debate about whether that constitutes an insurrection, the insurrection concept being the boundary. And if it's labeled an insurrection, what are the implications legally and politically for whether or not he can run in the next campaign? Another example was the World Food Program. And the director of the program was talking about budget cuts. And so if you Google that in the last couple of days, there's a big set of news stories around it. And this person was saying, we're having to now make a difference, set a boundary. They didn't use the language, but we're having to make a difference between who's hungry and who's starving. And we used to be able to provide food and support for those hungry. And now we only can support women and children who are considered starving. So that's another boundary between hungry and starving and the way those definitions get described. But this person was saying where that boundary gets set has implications for political instability in countries. So even though it's a food issue, it has political implications for security and instability with global ramifications. So another example of a boundary. And then a third is Venice. There was a conversation around whether or not Venice should be considered an endangered site and what this boundary set around endangered would mean in terms of protecting Venice from tourists and investment in protecting the physical and the ecological space there. So 3 everyday examples, listen out for them. They're all around us. Boundary is also a systems concept. So I'm not sure if you've seen this visual before, but on the top, you see this idea of a person thinking about the world as comprised of systems. That's one way of doing systems and having a systemic orientation. Another on the bottom is having the idea of complexity and things being interconnected and dynamic. In both of those spaces, and there are methodologies that come out of both of those orientations. Sometimes they're labeled hard and soft systems orientations, but in both of those spaces, boundary setting is really important. So in systems mapping and system diagramming, boundary setting is really important. And also in the way we frame issues and perspectives in the bottom, boundary setting is really important. So I'm not going to talk a lot about this systems thinking connection, but if you are taking a systemic orientation, boundary piece is a really formalized part of that. So why critique boundaries? I already hinted at some of the examples with my nieces and with these everyday ones, but practically boundaries are already a part of our work. And so like the simple sandcastle example, when they're creating the castle, they have implicit ideas of what is it for and what the activity is for. It's part of foundation strategy. It's part of evaluation. So let's be more purposeful and intention about it. But it's also ethical and has to do with equity because boundaries have to do with inclusion and exclusion. So when we're intentional about boundary setting and also critiquing, opening ourselves up to critique in terms of our boundaries, we can actually mitigate harm. We can anticipate and mitigate potential harm. And there are also avenues to shift power and possibility. So these are a few of the reasons to critique boundaries that are practical and ethical. I've got them listed out. I'll go through them, but if you're looking to have conversations with people outside of this webinar, I thought a list of reasons might be helpful. So first, as I mentioned already, like when we work on the complexity of issues and understand that social change is complex, you have to set boundaries because you can't address all the interrelationships or all the perspectives. So there's an inevitability. When we intentionally look at boundaries, we can focus really on who might disagree or oppose our work, which is both practically and ethically useful. It helps make our own values clear. So there can be a trend of making our values as organizations clear and upfront. But the way that we frame our work is an act of boundary setting and giving the normative base for our choices and also the base in terms of process, who participated and who didn't. Within systems change, at the beginning, Huda mentioned mental models. Boundaries live in the space of mental models. So when we challenge and change boundaries, we're actually creating leverage around system change, especially when we're reframing big issues. And Tanya has an example of that. In terms of both strategy and evaluation, boundaries are an area where we can look at potential side effects and unintended consequences. So when we don't look at them, we can think of something as unintended or a side effect because it was outside of our purview. But when we identify them systematically and go through them, then we really have a better chance of identifying and anticipating those. They have consequences for how well or how poorly issues and people are treated. That line between hungry and starving is a really palpable example of that. And then this idea of shifting power and privilege. So when we are in a seat, meaning whether you're a foundation group or an evaluation team, and you have a lot of authority over which boundaries get set and how, and you open that up, then you can shift your power and privilege around that. So what's a boundary that shapes your work? This is a chance to think about this in your work and enter something in the chat. As I was talking and as I was giving some examples, were there any boundaries that come to mind in your work? These could be things that you're having active conversations about challenging or things that are so implicit in the way that you work. Place-based system change is one example. I did this for a group and they talked about place-based being a really important boundary and the geographical region setting a boundary in their work. So I'm going to pause and give about a minute to look for some examples in the chat of a boundary that shapes your work. Great, I see some coming in. Mm. Yeah, great. So there are a couple in the examples. I would start there in your boundary critique. So I'm going to talk about a method that identifies certain kinds of boundaries to look at. Yeah, awesome. But I would start with the ones that are most salient and most in front of you in your work. One that I run into as an evaluator a lot is this idea of what's measurable and what counts as outcomes and the way we define outcomes versus a broader set of consequences of the work, and where to draw the boundary around what's considered within an evaluation scope and what's considered outside of the evaluation scope. Okay, so that was a little bit about boundaries and why I critique them. Now I'm going to talk about a framework and process. And again, we'll have time in the Q&A to get further questions. But if you've got questions about the first part, feel free to put them in the chat as well, because Huda can see them and track them. So there's a framework and process to critique boundaries called critical systems heuristics. And that was one of the pre-readings to check it out. And there are more readings in the references. The first thing I want to say is there's a lot of work on systems orientations, as I mentioned. The systems fields historically came out of different academic fields and disciplines. So if you've never seen this visual before, they're listed on the left. And in the middle are a bunch of, on the left side of the blurbs are a bunch of arrows and names. So different scholars, particularly who are working across fields, who wanted to study and theorize and also influence change on systems, organize different arenas, which are like subfields within the systems field more broadly. And in the blue box are systems approaches. So there's a lot of work theoretically and practically. The yellow circle on the bottom is where I'm going to be drawing from, which is this applied and critical orientation. And so it's much more focused on the upper orientations, or the upper approaches, are really about thinking about interrelationships and interconnections. In the middle is more about perspectives and values and weighing those. And the bottom is really thinking about boundary setting. That's a generalization, but that's one way that the systems fields have been mapped. So I've got some slides in the back of this deck about who developed critical systems heuristics, but what I want you to know is that it has deep philosophical roots. And so it really thinks about, if we understand ourselves and the world around us as complex, this act of setting boundaries, which many of which already live in the discourse and the language that we use, has this ability to shape reality. And so the idea of boundaries being ways of influencing change in themselves is really important. And this idea of inquiry, applied research, and also intervening in society being really key places in which we have to consider boundaries as a big part of the origins. So it's about making them explicit and critiquing them. And this can be used in different ways. The idea is, when you're designing a system, including a system of inquiry, like an evaluation, or interrogating an existing one. So critical systems heuristic, in a simplified version, it identifies 4 areas of boundaries. So you listed some boundaries in the chat that could be important to look at. These are grouped into 4 categories or 4 clusters, which are sources of influence. So whenever you set up any system, these are really important, and that they've been identified for a long time. The origins of this was in the early 80s. And really before that. So they've been developed and used for a while. 3 of the boundary areas have to do with those involved. So these are the people directly involved in the evaluation or in the strategy, and they have to do with motivation, power, and knowledge. So these things could be explicit or implicit, and I'm going to unpack a little bit more of what I mean in a minute. But the main argument of a critical systems orientation is that it doesn't matter what those people involved directly in an initiative, whether that's strategy or evaluation, think about what constitutes value or success. The source of legitimacy of any system is based on the perspective of those excluded. So there's this inherent idea that we do better work by subjecting ourselves to critique. And the only way we can be considered to do good work is if those who might be potentially harmed or excluded by our work see the work as valuable and see it as legitimate, which is a really tricky thing to do in practice, which is why Tanya's examples are going to be helpful as well. So there's 12 questions, and I won't go through all of them, but they're listed here, and there are two modes for asking them. They're the descriptive mode, what it currently is, and what it should be. And within each of those four areas, there are these boundaries that are embedded in the questions. And these are things we often already ask ourselves. They're already familiar to us. Sometimes the language is clunky and you can tweak the language, but the basic idea is to ask the question and answer it in terms of what it is and what it could or should be, and to do that from different perspectives, to have some sort of dialectic or dialogue around it. So how could you use this? How could you ask and answer those questions? You can do it by clarifying and reflecting on the boundaries that already shape your work. You do that by filling out the is and should be, and using those questions as a kind of template. You can do it, as we've been mentioning, pressure testing a strategy, so inviting discussion. You can pick a couple of boundary areas and ask different members of a community or a stakeholder group around what it should be, how to set that boundary. And then you can also do it in an early process of designing a monitoring and evaluation learning system. So you can self-interrogate the ways that some of those boundary assumptions would be set, and then what that would mean for the nature and scope of the evaluation. So these are the questions, again, in bigger font and in a little bit of a slower pace. But motivation has to do with purposes, has to do with beneficiaries, who benefits or should benefit, and what success should mean. Power has to do with decision-making authority, and also resources that decision makers should have access to and influence over. And then the third one is around those things that decision makers should not have access to or do not. So they're outside of the decision maker's control. And then the combination of motivation that's driving a system or driving a strategy or an evaluation, and power gives a lot of shape, gives a lot of influence. The third one is knowledge or expertise. So who are the experts and who should be the experts, and whether or not, especially in the equitable evaluation conversation, there's a lot of stretching and debate or ongoing conversation around ideas of rigor. And when we expand methodologies, what does that mean for what counts as data, what counts as evidence? So this is a space to consider critically those sources of expertise. And the third one under knowledge is this basis of success guaranteed, which in research and evaluation in general, a lot of times a good evaluation depended on the design and ideas of rigor. And much more now, the basis of success or the mechanism in which we could assure potential success has to do with process, has to do with participation and process. So that third one can be tricky sometimes, but it's this idea on what basis are we assuring ourselves that we're doing the right thing. And then the fourth one has to do with legitimacy. And so this has to do with not those directly involved, but those affected. And there's a lot of ways to open up who counts within those involved. So that's a more inclusive group of people, a group of agents or actors. But legitimacy recognizes that there will always be exclusion. And I like to give two examples. One is the idea of future generations in our decision making. So it's often future generations or people who are not yet here, or kids who are not yet here, are often can't be recognized. But legitimacy and this idea of witnessing gives a space for, okay, where is the representative there? And then we often have a very human focused conversation and framing. And so thinking about ecological and environmental and other kinds of species involvement in processes is another example of a witness, where you might never be able to directly have a representative, or sorry, have a direct participation, but the idea is to have a witness or a representative of that area or that group that's affected. And then these last two are really the most powerful and the deepest. The second question listed here has to do with emancipation. And this is the idea that those affected should have space to disagree and should have space to determine their own life or their own perspective on the issue that's outside of the scope of those involved. And so this can typically, like a concrete example I like to use in evaluation is that even when you define success and you have criteria or you have outcomes, creating open-ended qualitative methods where people can define for themselves what that means is one small way of this idea of emancipation and giving people agency to influence their own perspective on something. And then the last one has to do with worldviews. And so this is really the heart and crux of critical systems. It's this idea that when we try to influence system change in our work, whether that's strategy or whether that's evaluation, there should be space for value pluralism. There should be space to bring people together and have differing worldviews coexist, and that should be okay, rather than a kind of dominance of one over the other. But it also can be practically really tricky. How do you bring them together, and how do you create a generative exchange? So with that, I think Tanya is going to share an example of pressure testing strategy, and then we will talk a little bit about ways to get ready to apply this in your work.
Excellent. Thanks, Emily. I thought it might be really useful to share with you all a little bit more detail about a story that's included in one of the pre-readings about using boundary critique as an accountability mechanism for foundations in their effort to make equity commitments real. And so this is a story about a foundation in the state of Colorado in the United States. It's one of the largest health foundations in the country. And they have long had an area of work focused on food security and food access. And if you imagine, as a health foundation, the frame has traditionally been, they've always thought about healthcare access and coverage, health prevention issues, nutrition and activity, physical activity, kind of a conventional set of issues that are directly related to health. And they had long had a focus on equity and conversations in the foundation on equity. And around this time, this was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, they built out a new initiative and a new strategy to advance their food security goals. And they were really concerned with racial disparities, in particular in food deserts in the city of Denver and more broadly across the state of Colorado. And they used a fairly conventional landscape scanning expert consultation process to develop the strategy. They scanned where the food deserts were. They did some really creative and innovative GPS efforts to track those things. They studied where the most effective food security solutions how they had played out in other states and cities. And they developed an initiative around food security that was addressing food deserts by bringing in, creating incentive systems to bring in grocery chains and locate them, subsidize them for low-income communities in low-income communities. And they were pretty creative about a lot of the aspects of the work. But one staff member in this process felt that something was really off and they weren't going deeply enough in their thinking about equity. And so they went through a boundary critique process that included a series of interviews and focus groups with a range of actors across the system, including quite a few business owners and community members from the communities in the food deserts, which now, from this perspective and this point in time, seems a little bit like, well, of course we should do that. And they had done a few interviews with some kind of community leaders, but still just sort of counted that as interesting feedback and included it in their initial overview, but it hadn't really shaped the initiative all that much. And so when they went through that set of 12 questions, the set of questions that Emily just laid out, and they asked those very intentionally of different stakeholders, and then they synthesized across all of those stakeholders what the different responses were. And they compared it from what they said they thought the solution is, that was their current strategy. And they asked everyone else the should be version of that question. What should it be? And this is a really simple synthesis of what they got back, but it shows the kind of main rift or the main piece of challenge or contestation that they got to the strategy they developed through this boundary critique process. So their purpose was originally framed as food security. And the biggest pushback, of course, came from folks in the community wanting a food justice orientation. And so what did that mean? For them, the food security frame had led them to really define the primary beneficiaries as food insecure people. And existing food charities would also benefit. There were charities that had been really successful food banks and other providers across the community who would be partners with the incoming grocery chain to set things up and move food donations and create a relationship between food banks and the grocery chains in the communities that had food deserts to make it viable for the grocery chain. But also who benefits from this that the foundation had never named before was the corporate owners of the land where this would happen and corporate suppliers of food. But what they heard through the boundary critique process was that, yes, food insecure people were also a priority in the communities that were sort of targeted by this initiative. But also who should benefit were business owners of color located in communities who had already suffered from systemic racism as they lost their businesses to larger corporate interests that were not located in the community. They also wanted local landowners to benefit, people who still owned land in the area who might lease their buildings to this effort. They were also concerned about whether or not food workers would be paid a fair wage and how this would affect local growers who often had small informal farmers markets that were filling some of those food systems gaps. They also, in the decision-making question, they came back saying, actually, instead of the foundation staff and the existing food charities who didn't normally represent the communities that were being addressed, and the national food security experts coming in, the decision-making should actually live with the community forum of citizens in the community. So on the next slide, there's a few other categories of the boundary critique I just want to go through that had a lot of implications also for the evaluative approach for this. They had defined for their board that they were prioritizing equitable food security. They wanted to close some of the disparities in food security in the city. And as a health foundation, they prioritized nutrition and health. But they got really challenged and a lot of pushback from the communities that had been identified as food deserts, that they should put equal emphasis on whether the food was culturally appropriate. They also wanted nutrition, but in addition, they were hoping for high wage jobs and economic return to the community as real signals of a successful initiative around food justice. And they really challenged the concept of a traditional external evaluation that took a very objective stance with a particular definition of rigor. And this plays out in a few different categories in the boundary critique question. But what they felt like that external evaluation wouldn't do was create a channel or an opportunity for community members who were experiencing food insecurity and the solution to regularly define and test and participate in the evaluative process to determine if it was working for them. And so this is a pretty clear example of the difference between a frame, how even just that initial boundary of what's the purpose can cascade through a whole set of other decisions and choices. So the foundation has tried in many other occasions now to keep using a critical systems heuristics approach, boundary critique approach in their planning processes to really pressure test their strategy. And I'll talk more in a few minutes, and maybe actually now. I don't know if you want to frame up this next part. I want to talk more about what some of the implications of this have been for this foundation and some others practically. But before I do that, Emily, do you want to add anything else or any other reflections on that example?
Yeah, the only point that I want to add is that I listed the questions linearly, and that's how they are listed online. But you revealed, Tanya, in that example really well how they interact and they flow. And you don't have to start with one and you don't have to do them all. So if there's like in an evaluation, sometimes we go immediately to decision making and power, and then to evidence or knowledge and expertise, and then to the first and last ones. So they're interrelated. Don't feel like you have to start from one and go to the other. And then from a design perspective, your example, Tanya, started from a what is, and then getting input on the what should be. But when we design something, sometimes we start with a what should be. So if you say, I want to have an equitable approach to X, you can invite a process by which different people are saying, and that would mean this. So from an equity orientation, what would power look like? And you can fill it out before there's been anything designed. So you can play around with like the modes and the sequencing in a way that fits your purpose. That's really all I want to say, Tanya, and then hand it to you, because I can sometimes be theoretical and methodological about this, but it's a lot more meaningful to consider what then the risks are, the consequences are, and how to upstream consider those as it plays out.
Well, and as we go into this story, I have a kind of a cautionary tale about preparing your own institution to do something like this that I want to tell you about before I go into tips. But I think even before that, one of the things that I want to point out that was also kind of a big realization for me is that in at least in the foundations I had worked with, many of those strategy development processes are asking a lot of those questions in implied ways, sometimes really explicitly. What should this look like? How do we how do we set the boundaries? What outcomes matter or are important for this approach? However, one of the differences that the boundary critique approach really invited, so I, as a former evaluation director in a foundation, had a lot of responsibility for those kinds of landscape scans and strategy development processes. And what I noticed is that what we would do most of the time, and what I still see many foundations do, is they do that broad landscape scan and then they synthesize into a cohesive story that in general, right? So most people think we should do this, or they kind of synthesize all of that feedback into here's the best approach. And what the boundary critique, even in the example of the Colorado Health Foundation, what the boundary critique kind of forces you to do is to actually keep that disaggregated, those responses, and to say people speaking from this perspective who occupy this role in the system, for example, maybe those who benefit from the current approach, prioritize this. People who are actually bearing the brunt end of the disparity or the inequity prioritize this. And sometimes even within those categories, those aren't, it's not cohesive. And so in the example of the Colorado Health Foundation, what they really had to do was actually, when it was presented to them like that, they actually had to grapple transparently with whose perspective do we prioritize, and who gets to determine who are we listening to. Are there places where people who are going to who are kind of current winners in a system are going to lose out? Do we care? Does it matter that they're going to lose? Do we need to negotiate out a different approach that finds middle ground? It really forced a level of reckoning with those differences that philanthropy in the United States is not all that great at taking seriously and looking in the face and being transparent about. Really dealing with this question of to whom and for what do we want to be accountable? And so this cautionary tale kind of illustrates that example. So there's another foundation in the US, I'm not allowed to name, that used a boundary critique approach. This was also a strategy pressure testing, but it was kind of at a midpoint in a strategy. And they had an evaluation of their 5-year strategy process at the midpoint, and they were doing a check to see if they were still on the right trajectory. And they used a boundary critique approach. And it was an initiative that was focusing on American democracy and trying to really grapple with civic engagement and equity in the American democratic process. And they had a deep expertise on staff and a very strong public commitment to equity as a foundation. And within their staff team that ran the Democracy Initiative, they really took the equity commitment very seriously. And so they decided to engage in a boundary critique as a mechanism for really testing their assumptions about the strategy, where it had been and where it should go. They did a lot of, they proposed the idea internally. The CEO of the foundation said, this is a great idea. The leadership was excited about the feedback they would be likely to get. So they engaged in a pretty elaborate boundary critique process and reached out to a lot of partners and a lot of folks who had not been partners, who were focusing on, for example, racial disparities in voting access. And they got back some really strong contestation of their original ideas. And so the staff redesigned the strategy to be responsive to the communities who are most disenfranchised in the American democratic system. And they took it back to the CEO and the board, and they said, no way are we doing this. We don't believe this would work. This is not the approach. This is not what we're going to prioritize. We think we would take a lot of public heat if we did this, and we're trying to maintain a bipartisan approach. And so the staff had to go back to the people that they had interviewed and had this conversation with and say, we heard your perspective and it doesn't matter. It's not going to affect the way we move forward in this. And they burned a lot of social capital, and many staff ended up leaving the foundation over this tension. And it really damaged any trust that the foundation had built with these organizations that were most representative of the communities that were disenfranchised. And so there is a window that boundary critique can really open, a challenging window for foundations that you have to prepare yourself for and your institution for if you're going to do this, because if you don't, it can cause a lot of damage. So if you're not prepared to handle it, it can cause damage to relationships, to your reputation as an institution, to the trust that you've built with organizations of particular kinds. So I just want to give you a few ideas or tips about how you might approach that. So if you'll click forward one, Emily, I'll share these tips. So what we learned from that experience was that it's really important to internally grapple first with differing views internally about whose perspectives have legitimacy. If you're going to go out and ask different actors in the system what they think, you've got to decide when you get that information back, whose matters, how you're going to take them seriously, how are you going to balance the tensions within those. And so a lot of what we discovered in the cautionary tale is that if you haven't prepared for that kind of a conversation already, you are going to discover your differences institutionally in real time, which makes them much harder to handle. So you need to start that conversation earlier. Relatedly, the way we did that in this other group after we had this bad experience with the Democracy Initiative was to actually run through scenarios internally before engaging the boundary critique to say, well, what if we heard this? What if we heard that? Would we be able to respond? Would we be willing to respond? How might we use that feedback? Would we really shift any of these decisions that we've made? And if not, maybe don't do it because you're really you're exploiting a lot of time from other actors with no real intent to be responsive to it. Oops, I have a repeat of this other one. We also had to do it after, grappling ahead of time with, but also after with the differing internal views about that, whose perspectives have legitimacy and priority. And then lastly, anticipate and prepare for trade-offs, pushback, or even anger. This is the last comment I'll make, and then I think we should open it up for questions and discussions. Just to speak candidly about what I witness in the US philanthropic sector is that we have a lot of communications strategies that are designed to protect the foundation from critique, and manage reputational risk. And it means that foundations here are not all that accustomed to being critiqued publicly by any set of actors. And so, and then in turn, staff are not all that prepared. Staff and leaders and boards aren't all that prepared for pushback or anger. And the reality of boundary critique is it really makes visible those trade-offs and choices that you are then sort of forced to grapple with. So it adds a level of complication and complexity to the work that can be really difficult to manage, but also incredibly powerful as an engine for really dealing seriously with this question of how are you accountable for your equity promises. And so I'm thrilled that we went through all of those efforts, and also I think very carefully before I suggest a boundary critique approach to a foundation, because they really do need to be ready for a different encountering of tension and contestation out in the world. So with that, let's turn it over to questions and about the methods, about the approach, anything else we want to talk about, also ideas you might have for how or where this could be used.
Thank you so much, Emily and Tanya. That was fascinating. Please do post your questions in the chat. There is one already. I'm just going to read it out from Carolyn. So what are the skills and abilities that staff and boards need to strengthen and to do this kind of work well? Great question.
Emily, I just talked a little bit about that. What have you observed?
I mean, my initial reaction was just practice, because like I'm in a higher education institution, and within my department and within my school, there are still parallels in terms of people getting really into their mission and their set of values and their orientation around why they're doing what they're doing matters. And so that then can create like a buffer. And just as Carolyn raises, then it's not familiar, and it can be uncomfortable and feel risky to engage with differing worldviews and perspectives. So I just think it's practice. It's the more space, and maybe adding to your point, Tanya, it's practice in lower stakes ways, right? So figuring out where to practice and with whom and around what. But that issue I think is really important. I'll also say it's like a dimension of complexity that gets not written about enough. There's a lot of attention on complexity of social change in terms of causality and processes, but our own diversity and differing worldviews, I think it's a real good question, Carolyn, about how do we build capacity? And the only real advice I have is practice. Yeah.
The one of the things we noticed in the Colorado example was that the food justice, food access comparison, like once we wrote it up, they wrote it up clearly, like for their own they used it outside of their own team to say, see what this makes visible. And in a pretty simple way, it was like a lot of information, but in a pretty simple way because it's really difficult to see boundaries and think about their implications and how they might be differently defined oftentimes, right? Because they're so deeply embedded in our assumptions many times. So one idea also, Carolyn, is to actually practice hypothetically, have some training or some work. So the Colorado Health Foundation ended up using the write-up of the two frames and sets of feedback side by side for staff training, and had people play with it inside first. Well, what's another frame that would work for this initiative, and what might that mean? So they could just start to get a feel for it before you enter out into the larger field to start engaging other folks in that feedback loop.
Thanks, Emily. Great question.
I have a quick question. I wonder if, Emily, I know that you have materials in the pack on this, but I just wonder for those in the room who specifically are responsible for their evaluation function. So the example I gave was mostly about pressure testing strategy. But I wonder if you might just describe for a moment what people will find in the slides to help them think through even just how you use this to set up your MEL function and question how your MEL function functions. to support equity or not. And
Sure. So when you get the slide deck, there's a lot of references, but I organized them in a couple of groups, and a lot of it is not a lot, but some of it is my research. So I'm happy to share copies of anything that you might want. And then there are some slides with people's faces and their books or their resources and links. So there are different people who have played with applying critical systems heuristics as an entire way of designing an evaluation or designing a malfunction. And that Bob Williams's systemic evaluation design workbook in particular is useful. It doesn't have to be before you've done any design on the MEL side, but it's really moving through the same sets of questions. So I worked with a group in South America in the Amazon region around doing that, and thinking they were really interested in the ethics of the evaluation design. So how do we do a good evaluation design to answer these questions that we already have, but how do we set up an evaluative function that is ethically legitimate? That was the question. So there's a slide about that and one example, and they initially were saying like, oh, let's lean heavily on participation. And so for them, the process of boundary critique was actually participation is advantages us as the evaluation team, but it doesn't advantage all of the other groups in the same way. And actually it can be harmful to expect participation. For example, like the Part 1 partner NGO was really seeking resources and had a very limited staff capacity. So it was a big burden to ask for participation, just as a more specific example. So yeah, I mean, it's really moving through that same process, but considering the evaluation as a system or as an intervention itself, and answering the questions in the mode in relation to that.
Thanks.
That's super helpful. We've just got a couple of minutes left. I saw Ben pop up with a question. Ben, do you want to ask your question?
I will. Sorry, I'm a bit dark here. Great to see everyone. Thank you so much, Emily, Tanya. Fabulous stuff. And thanks for the advice about practicing, and kind of, I think I had also heard from that, start somewhere. And I love this idea of lower stake experimentation. I think that probably reads across to a lot of the other work around trust-based approaches. My question was, what if you feel as a foundation that not everything is up for grabs, but some things may be? So actually, purpose isn't up for grabs. That may be because you're actually spending someone else's money where purpose is tied to the funding, or because for historical reasons, you don't have any latitude on that. I mean, I suppose the question is that okay? Do these things become too flawed or corrupted, as it were, if you don't attend to certain elements? Can you cherry pick your way into this?
Thanks, Ben. Just one more minute to, if you can, very quickly. We've come up to time.
Emily?
I mean, my quick answer is it can be used to explain your why, to be transparent about your own boundaries. So, but Tanya, you gave an example where there was internal difference. So Ben, you're saying purpose is not up for grabs. I'm thinking whose voice is saying that? And there is a practical component to this too. So even if you're really committed to a specific purpose, unfolding the rest of the dimensions of what's behind that and being transparent about that can be really important. But also it's not win-lose necessarily. So in order to be successful and impactful, oftentimes we do have to sweep in other perspectives in the way our purposes get framed, and it can be advantageous to your initial purpose to do that. So it's not necessarily from a gain-loss mentality. It actually can be better practically as well as ethically to engage in that pluralism question. And if there are decisions that are like no, then it's that transparency piece. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We have come over time. It was such a fascinating talk. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Tanya. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I just wanted to do a quick plug. We are actually running a webinar for trustees on the 18th of October. I've popped some information in the chat if you wanted to check it out. So thank you so much again for coming, and see you again. Bye. Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone.
Bye.